I thought that joke proposal would remain an awkward memory between two best friends. Less than 6 months later, I discovered it was a perfect trap to steal my company, my professional identity, and my future. The most terrifying part wasn't her flawless lying, it was that I willingly handed her the first key. By the time I finally understood why she answered, "I thought you would never ask me." Too much had been stolen to walk away quietly. My name is June Fox. At 34 years old, I had constructed a life that looked flawlessly curated from the outside, much like the window displays I supervised. As the head of brand strategy at Halcyon Table, a premier high-end home goods chain headquartered in the damp, evergreen heart of Portland, my entire professional existence revolved around the illusion of effortless perfection. We sold handcrafted ceramic dining sets for hundreds of dollars and organic linen bed sheets that promised the kind of peaceful, undisturbed sleep usually reserved for the untroubled. My job was to convince our affluent clientele that their chaotic lives could be anchored, smoothed out, and held together by the right textures and muted color palettes. I played the exact same role in my personal life. I was known universally among my peers and colleagues as the anchor. I was the calm, fiercely intelligent, deeply principled woman who never raised her voice during a crisis in the boardroom. I was the one who managed the crisis, balanced the fragile egos of our executives, and invariably kept everything and everyone from falling apart. I prided myself on my sharp boundaries and my unshakable grip on reality. That is precisely why the trap, when it finally snapped shut around me, felt so devastatingly incomprehensible. I first crossed paths with Lila Hart exactly 7 years ago. We were both enrolled in a bleak, fluorescent-lit evening course on digital media analytics. It was raining on the first night of class, that persistent, bone-chilling Pacific Northwest drizzle that makes you want to retreat from the world entirely. I was sitting in the back row, silently agonizing over a spreadsheet, when Lila slid into the empty plastic chair beside me. She smelled faintly of vanilla and damp wool. Halfway through a mind-numbing lecture on engagement metrics, she pushed a notepad onto my desk. On it, she had sketched a remarkably accurate, highly unflattering caricature of the professor, accompanied by a note stating she would rather swallow dry concrete than listen to another minute of his voice. I stifled a laugh so violently I had to fake a coughing fit and excuse myself into the hallway. We became inseparable almost overnight. We cemented our bond over a shared arsenal of dry, razor-sharp humor and a mutual venomous distaste for half-hearted commitments. We despised people who gave less than 100%, and we absolutely loathed the modern dating scene. Very quickly, we developed a foolproof system for rescuing each other from disastrous evening encounters. If I was stuck at a dimly lit bar with a man explaining his cryptocurrency portfolio for 2 solid hours, my phone would invariably ring with a fabricated, highly detailed emergency from Lila. I did the same for her when she found herself trapped across the table from women who talked entirely about their exes. Within a year, our mutual friends began to joke that we behaved exactly like a couple who had been married for decades. The boundaries between my life and hers simply dissolved. We synced our digital calendars so we always knew where the other was. She knew without asking that I needed exactly 1 shot of espresso over ice after a stressful meeting, and I knew she could not tolerate the texture of cooked mushrooms. We were automatic +1s to every significant milestone: weddings, tedious corporate holiday parties, birthday dinners, and hospital waiting rooms. We were the permanent fixtures in each other's shifting landscapes. Naturally, we both attempted to date other people during those 7 years. I had a few relationships that stretched past the 6-month mark. Lila had her own fleeting romances, yet nothing ever took root. None of those partners ever managed to penetrate the inner sanctum of our lives. I always rationalized my own romantic failures with a clinical detachment. I told myself I was simply too fiercely dedicated to my career at Halcyon Table, too guarded, and perhaps just too impossibly picky to settle down. I categorically refused to acknowledge the quieter, more inconvenient truth. I refused to admit that the reason my romantic relationships felt so hollow was because the emotional space a partner was supposed to occupy was already entirely filled. Whenever I received a promotion, suffered a setback, or merely saw something mildly amusing on the street, the very first person I wanted to text was always Lila. No one else ever stood a chance. The turning point arrived on a Tuesday evening in late October. I had just survived a brutal 4-hour presentation to our executive board regarding our first quarter projections. I was completely drained, running on nothing but adrenaline and stale coffee. I drove straight to Lila's apartment building, seeking the only sanctuary that actually worked. We ended up sitting on the tar-papered roof of her building, wrapped in oversized wool blankets to block the biting autumn wind. The sky over Portland was a heavy, bruised purple, and the city lights blurred through the light mist. We were drinking incredibly cheap red wine straight from the bottle, passing it back and forth, entirely abandoning any pretense of elegance. The conversation drifted, as it often did on nights like these, to the utter exhaustion of trying to find love in our 30s. We traded horror stories of recent dates, laughing until our ribs ached, but the laughter eventually hollowed out into a shared, heavy sigh. Lila leaned her head back against the brick parapet, staring up at the starless sky. She rolled the wine bottle between her palms. She looked tired, her usual sharp edges softened by the shadows and the alcohol. She let out a quiet breath and muttered that if things continued exactly like this, if we were just going to keep cycling through endless, disappointing strangers, we should probably just marry each other and spare ourselves the profound exhaustion of dying alone. It was a familiar trope, the kind of pact friends make in college dorm rooms and forget by morning. I let out a loud, genuine laugh. I reached over, took the glass bottle from her hands, raised it in a mock toast toward the glowing skyline, and said the words with casual, effortless affection. "All right then, Lila, marry me." I fully expected her to laugh, to clink her imaginary glass against mine, to add another layer to the joke, but the silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. The ambient noise of the traffic below seemed to drop away entirely. Lila did not laugh. She did not move to take the bottle back. Instead, she turned her head slowly to look at me. The mocking, cynical light that usually danced in her eyes was entirely gone, replaced by something raw and dangerously vulnerable. Her eyes were suddenly rimmed with red. The air between us grew impossibly heavy, charged with a sudden, terrifying gravity. She held my gaze for what felt like an eternity, her expression completely unguarded. Then, her voice dropped to a hoarse, trembling whisper, barely audible over the wind. "I thought you would never ask me." The breath caught in my throat, freezing me in place. The casual smile died on my lips. In that single, suspended second, the tectonic plates of my entire reality shifted. 7 years of history rapidly rewound and replayed themselves in my mind under a blinding new light. Suddenly, I saw the lingering looks across crowded rooms that I had previously dismissed as friendly check-ins. I remembered the seemingly accidental touches, the way her hand always found the small of my back in a crowded hallway. I recalled the times she had displayed sharp, entirely unjustified jealousy over the people I dated, framing it flawlessly as protective concern for my well-being. It was a torrential flood of realizing that none of it had been meaningless. She had been waiting. I did not reply immediately. I could not find the words to express absolute certainty in that overwhelming moment. My heart was hammering fiercely against my ribs, but as I sat there on the cold roof, staring into the face of the woman who knew my every flaw and loved me anyway, I felt myself being swept up in a powerful, undeniable current. A profound sense of relief washed over my initial panic. I was suddenly enveloped by the intoxicating feeling that perhaps I had been overcomplicating my life for nearly a decade. The right thing, the absolute best thing that could ever happen to me, had been sitting right in front of me, perfectly disguised as my best friend, for so incredibly long. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and covered hers. We did not pretend that the air between us had magically reset by sunrise. The morning after that rooftop revelation, There was no awkward retreat into our usual sarcastic defense mechanisms. Instead, we sat across from each other at my quartz kitchen island, drinking strong black coffee, and made a conscious, deliberate choice to cross the line. We decided to truly date, abandoning any pretense that everything was exactly as it had been. We affectionately termed it upgrading a long-existing relationship. It felt incredibly terrifying, yet at the exact same time, it was the most purely logical decision I had ever made. The initial phase of our romantic transition was sweet to a degree that bordered on the absurd. Moving from platonic best friends to romantic partners is usually a chaotic landscape fraught with boundary negotiations and embarrassing missteps. But for us, the friction simply did not exist. There were absolutely no exhausting guessing games. There was no agonizing over how many hours to wait before sending a text message, no carefully curated outfits to project a specific image, and zero performative charm. Our daily rhythms and idiosyncratic habits were already perfectly synchronized. We slotted into each other's romantic lives with the satisfying click of a deadbolt sliding into place. Lila stepped into the role of my partner with a grace that felt almost miraculous. She possessed a forensic, encyclopedic understanding of my psychology, and she used it flawlessly. She knew exactly what I needed before I even possessed the vocabulary to ask for it. She knew I deeply despised loud environments, abhorred grand, public romantic surprises, and absolutely hated being forced to display emotional softness in front of an audience. Therefore, her affection was remarkably precise and quiet. It was the heavy wool blanket draped over my shoulders when I was hunched over my laptop at midnight. It was the way she smoothly intercepted and redirected overly chatty neighbors in our building lobby when she saw the social battery draining from my eyes. Every single gesture of care was perfectly calibrated to make me feel safe, unseen by the world, but entirely understood by her. When we finally broke the news to our inner circle of mutual friends over a Sunday brunch, the reaction was not surprise, but a collective, exasperated cheer. People actually clapped. They told us they had been waiting for us to stop being incredibly stubborn and just admit what the rest of the world had seen clearly for the better part of a decade. Basking in that warm, overwhelmingly positive glow of community validation, I felt something hard and defensive inside my chest finally crack open. For the very first time in my fiercely independent, tightly controlled adult life, I allowed myself to genuinely believe in the prospect of a stable, deeply anchored future. I let my guard down completely, convinced that the foundation we had built over 7 years was practically indestructible. I needed that emotional stability more than ever, because my professional life was rapidly turning into a pressure cooker. Halcyon Table was gearing up for a massive new funding round. We were aggressively pitching venture capital firms across the country, attempting to secure tens of millions of dollars to expand our brick-and-mortar footprint into international markets. The pressure radiating from the executive board was suffocating. I found myself working 14-hour days, constantly tweaking brand narratives, refining our market positioning, and agonizing over the exact phrasing of our pitch decks. My mind was a relentless storm of data points and growth metrics. During those brutal, exhausting weeks, Lila transformed my living space into a true sanctuary. Whenever I dragged myself through the front door at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, the chaotic noise of the corporate world was instantly muted. She never demanded my depleted energy. She would simply hand me a glass of wine, run a hot bath, and sit quietly on the edge of the tub while I decompressed. But slowly, she began doing something else, something that fascinated me and made me lean on her even more heavily. She started helping me untangle the intricate knots of my work. I would be lying on the living room rug, staring blankly at the ceiling, rambling about a bottleneck in our supply chain or a bitter clash regarding creative direction, and Lila would listen with intense, focused stillness. Then, she would start asking questions to help me look at our strategy from the outside. They were not the polite, vaguely supportive questions of a standard romantic partner merely humoring their stressed spouse. They were incredibly sharp, penetrating inquiries. She asked highly specific questions about our core brand identity. the shifting dynamics on the executive board, the specific voting rights of our major shareholders, and where the exact structural weaknesses lay within the company. I was genuinely stunned by how rapidly she comprehended the complex, cutthroat corporate warfare I described. I remember looking at her one evening, completely amazed by her incisive read on a situation I had barely finished explaining. I asked her how she grasped the nuances of corporate leverage so effortlessly. She simply smiled, a soft, self-deprecating curve of her lips, and explained that working as a freelance image consultant for high-net-worth clients required exactly that skill set. She told me her entire profession was based on reading people, understanding hidden agendas, and identifying who held the real, unspoken power in any given room. It made perfect sense to me. I felt incredibly lucky. Not only did I have a deeply loving partner, but I had gained a brilliant strategic confidant who could help me navigate the treacherous waters of my career. The pace of our relationship naturally accelerated, fueled by this intense emotional and intellectual intimacy. The final push toward permanent commitment came on a quiet, unassuming Friday evening. We were having a private dinner at my apartment, eating takeout green curry by the light of a single candle. I was deep in the tedious, highly stressful process of purchasing a beautiful townhouse. I was drowning in an ocean of mortgage pre-approvals, inspection reports, and escrow documents. Lila took a slow sip of her sparkling water, set her glass down on the wooden table, and very casually suggested that we should just go down to the courthouse and register for a civil marriage. She did not present it as a sweeping, dramatic, romantic declaration, which she knew perfectly well would make me tense up and overthink. Instead, she framed the proposal with undeniable, ironclad logic. She softly pointed out that formalizing our union legally would instantly streamline all of our long-term financial plans. It would make securing the mortgage exponentially easier by combining our assets. It would allow us to consolidate our premium health insurance policies, and it would give us a solid, legally recognized foundation as we merged our lives into this new house. She made the concept of marriage sound as practical and comforting as updating a vital software system to prevent a future crash. I hesitated, my fork hovering over my plate. Even for us, moving from a newly minted romance to a legally binding marriage within a matter of months felt dizzyingly fast. My naturally cautious, analytical brain immediately flashed warning signs about the sheer speed of the escalation. I was a woman who mapped out 5-year brand strategies. I did not make impulsive legal commitments over takeout food, but then I looked across the table at the woman sitting in the flickering candlelight. I systematically tallied up the evidence in my mind. We possessed 7 solid years of unwavering friendship. We had an established foundation of absolute, unquestioned trust. And now, we had a romantic connection that felt completely right and effortless. I easily convinced myself that our extensive, heavily tested history made us infinitely more equipped for marriage than couples who had dated for 2 or 3 years without ever truly knowing each other under the crushing weight of real adversity. We had the data. We had the unbreakable bond. It was the most logical next step. I pushed my hesitation aside, reached across the table to interlock my fingers with hers, and agreed to become her wife. Our wedding took exactly 15 minutes. We stood before a city clerk on a Tuesday morning, wearing tailored wool coats against the November chill, and signed the legally binding documents that tied our lives together. It was entirely unpretentious, exactly as I had always wanted. By the time we walked out of the heavy brass doors of the courthouse, I felt a quiet, solid satisfaction. Less than 48 hours later, Lila began moving her carefully curated vintage furniture and boxes of art books into the new townhouse I had just secured. The deed to the property and the agonizing 30-year mortgage were strictly in my name, a fact I had insisted upon during the escrow process simply because I was the one fronting the heavy down payment. Lila did not object. Instead, on our 3rd night in the house, she casually slid a banking brochure across the marble kitchen island. She suggested we open a joint checking account specifically for household expenses, property taxes, and shared utilities. It made perfect logistical sense. I deposited $10,000 to establish the baseline, and she matched it. From that point forward, a subtle shift occurred in the architecture of our daily lives. Lila, seemingly acting out of an abundance of spousal devotion, began aggressively absorbing my administrative burdens. She noticed the dark circles under my eyes and the way I routinely forgot to pay the municipal water bill on time. She insisted that I needed to rest more and protect my creative energy for the company. Within a month, she was managing our shared calendar, paying the contractors renovating our master bathroom, scheduling my dental appointments, and filing away my personal financial statements. I surrendered these tedious tasks with immense gratitude, entirely blind to the fact that I was actively handing over the administrative blueprints of my existence. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at Halcyon Table was undergoing its own seismic shift. We had recently brought in a new chief executive officer, a man named Graham Vale. Graham was a charismatic, ruthlessly pragmatic corporate veteran imported from a massive global lifestyle conglomerate. He immediately recognized my value. During executive alignment meetings, he would frequently point across the mahogany table and declare that I was the actual brain behind the aggressive market growth we had experienced over the past 2 years. He publicly credited my strategic foresight for keeping the brand relevant. When I brought these stories home, Lila was the picture of a proud, supportive wife. She would pour me a glass of expensive bourbon and ask me to recount the meetings word for word, but her curiosity soon developed a highly specific, forensic edge. She stopped asking about my emotional state and started asking precise questions about the corporate hierarchy. She wanted to know the exact background of our head of legal. She inquired about the risk tolerance of our chief financial officer. Most unusually, she asked highly detailed questions about the internal equity bonus structure, wanting to know exactly how many shares I was fully vested in and what the acceleration clauses looked like if the company was acquired. I found it slightly odd, but I simply chalked it up to her background in consulting. She was a woman who understood systems, and I assumed she just wanted to understand mine. The first genuine crack in the foundation appeared on a rainy Thursday. I had developed a blinding migraine and decided to leave the corporate campus early, pulling into my driveway at exactly 3 p.m. I walked through the front door, kicked off my heels, and padded quietly into the kitchen. Lila was sitting at the dining table, intensely focused on her open laptop. As I walked up behind her to kiss the top of her head, my eyes flicked to the glowing screen. She had an email open. Attached to that email was a heavily restricted, confidential PDF of the Halcyon Table fourth quarter strategic roadmap. It was a document I had downloaded to my own encrypted home office drive the night before. Lila closed the laptop with a smooth, unhurried motion. She did not jump. She did not slam the screen down. She simply turned her head, offered a perfectly warm smile, and reached up to touch my cheek. She calmly explained that she had seen the file sitting on my desktop when she borrowed my computer to print a shipping label earlier, and she had just emailed it to herself to read on her own laptop. She said she merely wanted to understand the sheer scale of the brilliant work her wife was doing. A sharp, cold prickle of discomfort bloomed at the base of my neck. Protocol dictated that sharing unreleased roadmaps outside the executive team was a fireable offense. I told her, my voice tighter than I intended, that those documents were strictly confidential and she had no business transferring them to her personal devices. Lila's expression instantly dissolved into deep, contrite apologies. She stood up, wrapped her arms around my waist, and pressed her face into my shoulder, whispering that she was so incredibly sorry for overstepping. She used her gentleness as a weapon to completely diffuse the tension, making me feel absurdly rigid and overly paranoid for snapping at a partner who only wanted to admire my intellect. I swallowed my unease and deleted the email from her outbox myself. Exactly 3 weeks later, my lingering paranoia crystallized into something far more tangible and terrifying. I was sitting in a high-level creative alignment meeting with the executive board. Graham Vale was presiding at the head of the table. A senior colleague of mine, a notoriously ambitious woman named Nadia Bloom, stood up to present a new proposal for a massive brand repositioning campaign aimed at the European market. As Nadia began clicking through her presentation slides, the blood slowly drained from my face. The core concept, The specific demographic targeting, the nuanced tonal shifts in the proposed marketing copy, even the specific architectural metaphors used to describe the brand evolution. They were all mine. It was an incredibly distinct, highly unconventional idea I had been quietly developing in my own head for months. I had not written a single word of it down on company servers. The only time I had ever spoken those exact concepts aloud was late one night, lying in bed in the dark, whispering them to Lila. I sat frozen in my ergonomic leather chair, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I watched Nadia present my intellectual property flawlessly. When a board member praised the sheer ingenuity of the concept, Nadia smiled modestly and stated that the proposal was actually directed by Graham, who had recently been consulting with a highly exclusive, external creative partner. A wave of pure, absolute ice washed over my skin. External creative partner. I had absolutely no hard proof. If I stood up in that boardroom and accused the chief executive officer and a senior colleague of stealing an idea I had only ever discussed in the privacy of my own bedroom, I would look like a hysterical, territorial lunatic. I forced myself to nod, to take measured notes, and to survive the remaining 45 minutes of the meeting without betraying the violent storm of panic erupting in my chest. That evening, I paced the length of our living room hardwood floor, recounting the entire nightmare to Lila. My hands were shaking. I explained the terrifying impossibility of Nadia presenting an idea that had previously existed solely in my mind and in the space between us on our pillows. Lila walked over, her face a perfect mask of sympathetic concern. She pulled me into a tight, warm embrace, stroking the back of my hair exactly the way I usually loved. Her voice was incredibly soothing, practically a lullaby, as she softly reasoned with me. She told me that the hyper-competitive, toxic power environment at Halcyon Table was finally making me see ghosts. She suggested that perhaps great minds simply think alike, or that I had unconsciously dropped hints to Nadia during a casual conversation months ago. She held me closer and firmly advised me not to start a destructive corporate war when I had absolutely no tangible evidence to back up my claims. I stood there in her arms, inhaling the familiar scent of vanilla and damp wool, and for the very first time, the sanctuary of her embrace felt remarkably like a cage. The fallout from that stolen presentation did not manifest as a sudden, violent explosion within the company, but rather as a slow, agonizing bleed. Exactly 14 days after my stolen vision was presented in the boardroom, Halcyon Table abruptly announced a comprehensive internal restructuring of the brand strategy department. It was framed in a perfectly polished company-wide memo as a necessary evolution to meet aggressive new market demands. In reality, it was a systemic, calculated dismantling of my authority. Whole blocks of my daily responsibilities, massive projects I had nurtured from their absolute infancy over the past 2 years, were surgically removed from my portfolio and transferred directly to my newly minted rival. The chief executive officer orchestrated the entire transition with a terrifyingly polite veneer. Whenever I encountered Graham in the glass-walled corridors, he offered a warm, blindingly white smile, asking about my weekend and loudly praising my foundational contributions to the brand. Yet, I found myself systematically excluded from the closed-door executive sessions where the actual future of the company was being decided. My daily calendar, once overflowing with high-level strategy alignments, suddenly featured glaring, humiliating gaps. I was being politely but forcefully exiled from the very empire I had spent thousands of hours helping to construct. The isolation was profound, leaving me sitting in my corner office staring at a silent phone, fully aware that the real conversations were happening exactly one floor above me without my input. The professional suffocation was almost unbearable, but the true psychological horror was waiting for me at home. When I laid out the alarming sequence of corporate shifts to my spouse, desperate for her usual razor-sharp strategic advice, her reaction was entirely different than I expected. Instead of validating my very real panic, she adopted a tone of infuriatingly calm, clinical concern. She poured me a cup of chamomile tea, her voice dripping with artificial soothing. She gently suggested that perhaps the relentless pressure of the past 24 months had finally caught up with me and compromised my objectivity. She told me I was reacting purely on emotion, reading malicious intent into standard corporate shuffling, in a move that made my stomach churn with a sudden, violent wave of nausea. She softly proposed that I request a 90-day leave of absence to clear my head and, in her exact words, prove to the executive board that I was not becoming fundamentally unstable. That specific word, unstable, acted as a corrosive acid on my remaining trust. It forced me to step back and look at the board from a terrifying new angle. Over the next 3 weeks, a chilling pattern crystallized in front of my eyes. Every single time I confessed a professional anxiety to her in the darkness of our bedroom, every time I mapped out a potential strategic countermove to protect my remaining territory, I found myself completely outmaneuvered at the office within 48 hours. If I planned to pivot a marketing budget to secure a specific vendor, my rival would submit a preemptive proposal locking down a cheaper alternative the very next morning. If I worried aloud about a specific board member's wavering loyalty, Graham would suddenly announce a private dinner with that exact individual. It was not a series of unfortunate coincidences. It was a flawless, synchronized dance. It felt precisely as though my deepest, most private thoughts were being wiretapped and broadcasted directly to the people actively trying to destroy my career. The final, devastating blow to my rapidly crumbling reality arrived via a secured email from an old university friend who practiced real estate law. He had handled the closing paperwork for my townhouse as a personal favor. I had asked him to review a minor municipal zoning issue regarding the property line, but his message contained something entirely different and infinitely more dangerous. He called me on a secure line at exactly 4 p.m. on a Wednesday. His voice was unusually tight, stripped of its usual warmth. He asked me if I was fully aware of the sweeping financial access addendum attached to the very back of my mortgage dossier. I felt a cold sweat break out across my collarbone. I told him I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. He calmly explained that tucked deep within the 200 pages of digital closing documents was a profoundly broad power of attorney clause specifically regarding my personal financial assets. It had been electronically signed from my secure personal email address. This addendum did not just give my spouse access to our shared household checking account. It legally permitted her to borrow against the equity of the house, access my private investment portfolios, and make binding financial decisions on my behalf in the event of my incapacitation. The digital timestamp indicated it had been executed exactly 3 days before our rapid civil ceremony at the courthouse. I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that I had never read, let alone authorized, that document. I drove home that evening gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, the blood roaring a chaotic rhythm in my ears. When I walked through the heavy wooden front door, she was standing by the kitchen island, peacefully arranging fresh-cut flowers in a tall ceramic vase. I did not yell. I did not throw things. I had spent my entire life mastering the art of maintaining composure under extreme pressure. I simply placed the printed copy of the addendum flat on the marble counter, slid it toward her, and asked her to explain the forged electronic signature. Her reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. The warm, supportive spouse vanished entirely in the space of a single heartbeat. She did not stumble over an apology. She did not attempt to soothe me with her usual gentle touch. Instead, she immediately weaponized my accusation, instantly transforming herself into a deeply wounded, fiercely indignant victim. Her voice turned brittle and sharp, echoing harshly off the high ceilings. She demanded to know how I could possibly stand there and accuse my own wife of forging legal documents and attempting to steal my life. She threw the heavy steel floral shears onto the counter, the metal clattering loudly against the stone, and launched into a vicious, relentless tirade about my crippling paranoia, my toxic corporate mindset, and my fundamental inability to trust anyone who loved me. That argument rapidly escalated into the most toxic, venomous conflict I had ever experienced in my entire adult life. There was absolutely no holding back. It was not a passionate disagreement between lovers. It was a brutal, calculated dismantling of my sanity for the very first time in 7 years. The carefully constructed mask slipped completely off her face. I looked across the kitchen island and saw a version of the woman I had married that I did not recognize at all. Her eyes were flat, cold, and utterly devoid of any recognizable empathy. Her posture was rigid, highly calculating, and fundamentally hostile. She was not a woman defending her honor against a baseless accusation. She was a grandmaster chess player deeply enraged that I had finally noticed a piece moving out of turn on the board. She eventually stormed out of the house, the heavy front door slamming shut behind her with enough force to rattle the window panes, leaving me standing completely alone in the suffocating silence of my own home. I did not sleep a single minute that night. I sat in the dark living room, wrapped tightly in a heavy blanket, staring blankly at the long shadows stretching across the hardwood floor. In that quiet, agonizing isolation, I finally forced myself to open the mental vault I had been terrified to touch for weeks. I meticulously retraced the entire chain of events. I went all the way back to the damp rooftop, to the cheap bottled wine and the sarcastic joke about marriage. I played every single memory forward, examining each supposedly spontaneous milestone under the harsh, unforgiving light of hindsight. The rapid, seamless transition from best friends to romantic partners. The flawless way she aggressively managed my household administrative tasks, while simultaneously extracting the granular details of my corporate equity. The highly convenient push for a fast, quiet civil union right before I closed on a massive real estate purchase. The stolen strategic roadmap. The constant, subtle gaslighting meant to make me question my own professional competence. The disjointed pieces snapped together with sickening, mathematical precision. It no longer looked like a tragic series of misunderstandings or a modern marriage naturally crumbling under external corporate pressure. It looked exactly like a meticulously engineered, flawlessly executed sequence of strategic maneuvers designed to systematically strip me of my assets and my professional identity. And then, as the first gray light of dawn began to creep slowly through the window blinds, the most terrifying realization of all settled heavily into my bones. If this was indeed a deliberate setup, a calculated plot to hollow out my career and drain my resources, it had not been constructed over the past 6 months. You do not gain this level of devastating, unrestricted access without profound, unquestioned trust. To achieve this kind of absolute, invisible infiltration, the trap had to have been slowly, patiently cultivated over the course of 7 long years. Every shared secret, every inside joke, every single moment of vulnerability had not been friendship. It had simply been vital data collection for the final, lethal strike. I did not scream when the sun finally broke through the heavy morning fog. I simply showered, dressed in a sharp charcoal blazer, and walked out the door, perfectly projecting the hollowed-out, brittle exhaustion that everyone in my life already expected to see. I did not engage in another shouting match with my wife. I let the toxic silence from the previous night settle over the house like a thick layer of dust. I needed her to believe that her vicious counterattack had worked, that I was retreating into a shell of self-doubt. On my lunch break, I drove to a chaotic strip mall on the outskirts of the city. I walked into a brightly lit electronics store and purchased a cheap, prepaid mobile device using physical cash. From the cramped, suffocating confines of my car, parked out of sight behind a commercial dumpster, I made a single phone call to a woman named Mara Sloan. Mara was a ghost in the corporate sector, a remarkably ruthless digital forensics expert who specialized in untangling high-stakes commercial fraud, hostile takeovers, and corporate espionage. A former compliance officer had quietly slipped me her contact information 5 years ago during a particularly vicious vendor dispute, whispering that Mara was the person you called when you needed to completely dissect a digital life without leaving a single fingerprint. We met later that evening in a windowless, soundproofed conference room at a co-working space registered under a shell corporation. I placed my personal laptop, my tablet, and my primary mobile phone onto the sterile white table and told her to tear everything apart. 72 hours later, I was sitting in the exact same chair when Mara projected her preliminary findings onto the blank wall. The presentation was completely devoid of emotion. A clinical autopsy of my ruined life. Mara had meticulously tracked the access logs for my encrypted cloud storage and my personal email servers. She pointed a laser pen at a cascading list of login timestamps. Over the past 4 months, my secure digital vaults had been quietly accessed dozens of times from an external Internet Protocol address. I asked Mara to trace the location. She pressed a button on her keyboard, and a registered business address appeared on the screen. It was a boutique creative studio located right in the trendy arts district of Portland. The registered owner of that studio was my wife, alongside a heavily shielded, anonymous corporate investor. A cold, paralyzing numbness began to spread outward from my chest. I asked Mara to dig into the studio's financial footprint, using back-channel data brokers. Mara pulled a series of redacted invoices and payment routing numbers. My wife was not merely acting as a freelance image consultant for wealthy individuals. She was operating a highly lucrative, shadow brand storytelling agency. And the primary client funneling massive, continuous payments into her corporate accounts was a private equity venture fund actively seeking to aggressively acquire distressed assets in the luxury retail space. They wanted halcyon table. The pieces fell into place with the sickening, heavy thud of a guillotine. The venture fund possessed direct, well-documented ties to our new chief executive officer, Graham Vale. The entire narrative crystallized before my eyes. Graham was deliberately sabotaging the company from the inside, systematically driving down the valuation to orchestrate a lucrative buyout for his private equity allies. But to execute the hostile takeover flawlessly, they needed absolute, unfiltered access to our internal strategic defenses. They needed to know our exact vulnerabilities, our product roadmaps, and the precise psychological makeup of the executive board. My wife was the invisible bridge. She was the conduit funneling the highly classified internal intelligence I unwittingly provided over glasses of wine straight to the financial rival attempting to swallow my life's work. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. I asked Mara about the digital signature on the sweeping financial access addendum attached to my mortgage. Mara pulled up a highly technical forensic timeline. She cross-referenced the exact second the electronic signature was verified against my own digital location data. At the precise moment my name was legally bound to that catastrophic document granting my spouse total control over my assets, I had been sitting in seat 4 on a commercial flight to Chicago, cruising at 30,000 feet, completely disconnected from any wireless network. It was technically and physically impossible for me to have signed it. Mara explained the mechanics with terrifying simplicity. The digital signature was technically valid because it was executed from my own personal tablet. My wife had simply waited for me to leave for a business trip, picked up the device I had left charging on my nightstand, bypassed the security using the passcode I had freely given her, and exploited the trusted device protocol to forge my consent. I sat in the sterile room, staring at the projected screen until my vision blurred. The physical pain in my chest was so acute, I had to remind myself to inhale. I was forced to confront the darkest, most agonizing truth of all. My marriage was not a tragic failure of love. It was a highly sophisticated legal vehicle. The wedding rings, the shared bank accounts, the joint calendar, the entire carefully constructed illusion of domestic bliss was nothing more than a tactical maneuver to gain unrestricted physical access to my devices, my confidential corporate files, and the legal legitimacy of residing inside my home. A lesser version of myself might have driven straight back to the townhouse, thrown the forensic report onto the marble counter, and demanded a divorce. I could have packed my bags, screamed until my throat bled, and walked away with a shredded heart. But the sheer scale of the violation demanded something infinitely heavier than a simple domestic dispute. If I confronted her now, with only preliminary digital breadcrumbs, she would undoubtedly deploy her masterclass acting skills. She would gaslight me, destroy the physical devices, alert Graham Vale, and completely cover her tracks before I could even draft a legal complaint. I needed much more than a strong intuition of betrayal. I needed a kinetic strike so overwhelmingly powerful and legally binding that absolutely no one in the corporate or legal world could ever throw her a lifeline. Mara leaned across the table, her eyes sharp and assessing. She told me point blank to forget about the emotional devastation of the broken marriage. She advised me that proving infidelity or domestic manipulation in a family court would only result in a messy, drawn-out financial settlement where she still might walk away with half my net worth. To truly destroy her, Mara said, I had to completely bypass the marriage certificate. I had to definitively prove that she was an active, willing participant in a coordinated criminal conspiracy to commit grand intellectual property theft and systematic contract manipulation. I looked at the digital evidence glowing on the wall, took a slow, deep breath, and agreed. The drive home that night was the longest journey of my life. I had to actively bury the woman I thought I loved in a shallow grave inside my own mind. I had to mentally sever every cord of affection, every shared laugh, and every tender memory we had cultivated over 7 years. The absolute hardest part was not accepting the loss of my future. The hardest part, the reality that continuously tore at the edges of my sanity, was accepting that the most beautiful, validating moment of my entire existence, the quiet rooftop, the shared bottle of wine, the tearful acceptance of a mock proposal, was precisely the moment I had been most skillfully, mercilessly preyed upon. I pulled my car into the driveway, killed the engine, and practiced my expression in the rearview mirror. I let my shoulders slump. I made my eyes look dead and defeated. I was going to walk through my front door, kiss the woman who was actively trying to ruin me, and play the role of the broken, exhausted wife perfectly. I was going to hand her the exact narrative she wanted, feeding her ego and her false sense of security, until the very moment I locked the cage and burned the entire forest down around her. I became a ghost inside my own skin. To catch a predator who operates seamlessly within your own home, you must perfectly mimic the scent of wounded, compliant prey. I began projecting an image of total, catastrophic burnout. I complained of crushing chest pains and blinding migraines, dragging my feet heavily across the hardwood floors every evening when I returned from the office. I purchased a bottle of heavy prescription sleep aids in cash from a pharmacy across town. Every night, I would stand in the master bathroom, loudly rattle the plastic vials so the sound carried down the hallway, and flush 2 capsules down the toilet. I would then collapse into bed, slowing my breathing into a deep, rhythmic cadence until I felt her cautiously slide out from under the duvet to roam the dark house, her bare feet silent against the floorboards. I became deliberately, strategically reckless with my digital hygiene. I left my unlocked smartphone face up on the kitchen counter while I took long, scalding showers. Most importantly, I began actively soliciting her guidance on fabricated corporate dilemmas. I played the role of the desperate, drowning executive grasping at her brilliant, supportive spouse for a lifeline, asking her exactly how I should handle my waning influence with the board. While I played the crumbling, paranoid wife at home, Mara and I were operating in the shadows to construct the perfect snare. We spent an entire weekend in that windowless co-working space drafting a highly classified, completely fictitious strategic initiative. We titled it the Sustainable Futures Project. It was pitched as a massive, aggressive pivot toward an exclusive line of biodegradable, ethically sourced diningware. It was a beautiful piece of corporate fiction, mimicking my exact writing style, my specific formatting quirks, and my usual strategic frameworks flawlessly. But the true genius lay in the poison we injected directly into the data stream. I intentionally buried highly specific, deeply flawed financial metrics deep within the proposal. I wrote that we projected a 42% profit margin within the first 18 months, based entirely on a fabricated, highly unusual supply chain deal in South America. I added a bizarre exclusivity clause regarding our raw material sourcing that no sane legal department would ever approve. These were not casual errors. They were completely unique markers, an invisible tracking die hidden within a dense river of corporate jargon. I deployed the bait on a Tuesday evening over plates of roasted salmon and asparagus. I poured myself a heavy glass of white wine, letting my hand tremble slightly as I brought the crystal to my lips. I sighed heavily, rubbing my temples, and confessed that I was terrified about a massive new project I was secretly developing to win back the favor of the chief executive officer. I leaned across the marble island, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, and outlined the Sustainable Futures Initiative as if I were handing her the last remaining piece of my professional soul. I spoon-fed her the specific data points, the 42% margin, the South American logistical timeline. I watched her face with the focused, unblinking intensity of a sniper hidden in the brush. She maintained a mask of casual, polite interest, nodding slowly while meticulously cutting her food. She told me to be incredibly careful, advising me to protect my intellectual property from the sharks circling my department. But right as she took a slow sip of her sparkling water, I saw it. A microscopic tightening of her jaw, a sudden, sharp gleam of predatory calculation flashing in the dark depths of her eyes. The bait had been swallowed whole. The venom took exactly 3 days to move through the corporate system. On Friday morning, a major competitor in the luxury home goods sector, a brand heavily backed by the very same venture capital fund circling our company, released an aggressive, highly funded press blitz announcing their sudden pivot to sustainable dining aesthetics. I sat in my corner office, locked the heavy glass door, and pulled up their official press release on my monitor. My blood ran completely cold. The structure of their campaign was a near-perfect carbon copy of my fabricated document, but the absolute confirmation, the undeniable, radioactive fingerprint, was buried deep in their investor relations packet. They proudly touted a projected 42% profit margin over an 18-month rollout, utilizing an identical flawed South American supply chain model. I printed the page and stared at the warm paper. The connection was no longer a theoretical suspicion, a paranoid intuition, or a string of digital internet protocol addresses. It was a bright, glowing, undeniable line connecting my dining room table directly to my wife and straight into a hostile corporate takeover network. I had the ammunition I needed to destroy her. But there was a masochistic, desperately human part of my soul that required one final autopsy of the heart. I needed to know if any of the affection, even a single fleeting moment over the past 7 years, had been genuine. I needed to know if she had ever loved me at all, or if she was simply a brilliant sociopath executing a long-term assignment with masterful, terrifying precision. That night, the house was quiet. We were sitting on the velvet sofa in the living room, a rare moment of manufactured peace between us. I let my head rest heavily on her shoulder, staring into the dark fireplace. My voice was soft, stripped of any corporate sharpness or hidden accusation, dripping with a manufactured, nostalgic vulnerability. I asked her to think back to that freezing night on the rooftop years ago, the night with the cheap wine and the heavy purple sky. I asked her what she thought would have happened if I had never made that stupid, sarcastic joke about marrying her. I asked if she thought we would still be just friends, wandering aimlessly through our separate lives. She did not hesitate. She did not offer a romantic monologue about destiny finding a way or our souls inevitably colliding. She stared straight ahead at the dark television screen, her hand resting casually on my knee. Her voice was perfectly level, incredibly calm, and completely devoid of any emotional warmth. "I think," she said softly, her fingers gently tapping my leg, "eventually, things would have had to happen anyway." A violent, icy shiver ripped down the entire length of my spine. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. It was not the wistful reminiscence of a woman who believed in the inevitability of true love. It was the terrifying, clinical assessment of a master strategist acknowledging that a flawlessly designed plan only ever differs in the exact moment of its activation. If I had not handed her the key that night, she would have simply waited, adapted, and found another way to pick the lock. In that freezing, suspended moment, the last lingering ghost of my marriage evaporated into the dark air. I closed my eyes, resting my head against the shoulder of a woman who was a complete and utter stranger, and silently made an unbreakable vow: I would no longer try to salvage this union. I would no longer seek emotional closure, look for hidden warmth, or demand tearful, dramatic confessions. The woman I thought I loved had never existed in the first place. From this exact second forward, I was entirely consumed by the pursuit of raw truth, bulletproof legal evidence, and the cold, methodical calculation of the final, lethal blow. I needed an ally with enough institutional gravity to crush a sitting chief executive officer. I reached out through a highly encrypted messaging protocol to Evelyn Price. Evelyn was the former chairman of the board for Halcyon Table, a ruthless, brilliant woman in her late 60s who had recently retired and liquidated the vast majority of her equity. Despite stepping back from the daily operations, she maintained a formidable, invisible grip on 3 of the remaining senior board members. During my rapid ascent at the company, Evelyn had always favored me. She had once pulled me aside after a grueling quarterly review and told me I was the only executive in the building who truly understood the soul of the brand, explicitly warning me about the hollow men who only knew how to slash budgets and sell off the remaining parts. We met at her private estate on the rugged coast, roughly 2 hours outside the city limits, on a dreary Tuesday afternoon. The sprawling stone house overlooked a gray, churning ocean. We sat in her mahogany-paneled library. I did not waste her valuable time with tears or emotional preambles. I slid a thick, leather-bound dossier across the antique table. It contained exactly 250 pages of Mara's forensic analysis, the verified wire transfer logs, the corporate registry of the Shadow Shell Company, and the undeniable proof of the stolen, poisoned Sustainable Futures Initiative. Evelyn put on her reading glasses and reviewed the documents in absolute silence for nearly 45 minutes. When she finally closed the heavy folder, her jaw was locked in a tight, furious line. She saw the architecture of the scheme instantly. Graham was deliberately sabotaging our internal metrics, systematically tanking the company's valuation so his private equity associates could execute a hostile, deeply discounted buyout. My spouse was the perfectly positioned corporate spy, actively facilitating the hemorrhage of our intellectual property to make the takeover completely seamless. Evelyn stood up, poured us 2 glasses of neat scotch, and declared war. We spent the next 3 hours constructing a highly weaponized, 2-pronged counteroffensive. The first phase would be a subterranean legal detonation aimed directly at the corporate fraud and the breached fiduciary duties. The second phase would be a public, inescapable execution. We decided to trigger the trap at the highly anticipated, expanded board of directors meeting scheduled exactly 12 days away. Before springing that trap, I had to secure my own perimeter. I moved with agonizing caution, terrified that a single misstep would alert the danger sleeping next to me. Over the course of 72 hours, I systematically dismantled our financial ties. Working exclusively from burner devices and physical bank branches during my lunch breaks, I quietly diverted my executive salary deposits into a secure, newly established offshore trust. I initiated a quiet, legally complex freeze on my personal investment portfolios, permanently blocking any potential margin loans or equity transfers. I filed emergency asset preservation injunctions through my private attorney, effectively neutralizing the forged power of attorney clause before she could ever attempt to drain my accounts. I left precisely enough capital in the joint household checking account to cover the monthly mortgage and utility bills, ensuring absolutely no financial alarm bells would trigger on her end. I smiled over dinner every single evening, playing the hollowed-out shell of a defeated woman, while simultaneously locking every single vault door. To ensure Graham and my spouse were completely blinded by their own towering hubris, I needed to hand them a definitive, unquestionable victory. The following Monday, I requested a private meeting with Human Resources and the Chief Executive Officer. I sat in Graham's expansive corner office, staring blankly at the floor, and told him the relentless corporate pressure was destroying my mental health. I formally offered my resignation. Graham's eyes gleamed with a predatory, victorious light, though he masked it expertly under a thick layer of faux corporate sympathy. He immediately slid a severance agreement across his polished desk. It was an insultingly low offer, guaranteeing only 3 months of base salary and requiring me to forfeit a massive percentage of my unvested stock options. The non-disclosure clauses were incredibly aggressive. I picked up the heavy steel pen and signed the preliminary intent to resign without a single moment of hesitation. It was the ultimate act of surrender. I wanted them to believe I was completely broken, retreating quietly into the shadows to lick my wounds, leaving the gates of the corporate citadel wide open for their taking. The news of my impending departure reached my wife before I even pulled my car into the driveway that evening. When I walked through the heavy front door, she was standing in the kitchen, pouring 2 glasses of expensive vintage champagne. She handed me a crystal flute, her face a masterclass in performative pity. She wrapped her arm tightly around my waist, her voice dripping with a condescending, cloying sweetness. She told me how incredibly proud she was of my bravery for stepping away from such a toxic, unappreciative environment. But as the evening wore on and the champagne bottle emptied, the mask of the endlessly supportive spouse began to slip, revealing the profound arrogance underneath. She grew careless, clearly intoxicated by the sheer perfection of her own sweeping victory. As we sat together on the velvet sofa, she began dropping subtle, patronizing remarks. She gently stroked my hair and murmured that I was a brilliant creative mind, an absolute genius with consumer psychology, but I was simply too pure, too painfully naive to survive the brutal, unforgiving realities of true corporate power. She strongly implied that the world belonged to those willing to play in the mud, and I was simply a delicate artist who needed protecting from the wolves. I kept my expression perfectly neutral. I took a slow sip of the dry champagne, letting the cold liquid slide down my throat. Every patronizing word she whispered against my neck cemented my absolute resolve. I was no longer just going to walk away from a fraudulent marriage. I was going to systematically strip away every single asset, every ounce of professional credibility, and every shred of freedom she had entered my house to steal. She thought she was comforting a naive casualty of war. She had absolutely no idea she was drinking with her own executioner. The final, devastating weapon for that execution was handed to me purely by accident. 2 days before the scheduled board meeting, I visited Mara in the windowless co-working space to finalize the digital presentation for the boardroom ambush. Mara was running a secondary, deep-level diagnostic scan on my home network logs when she noticed a persistent, highly encrypted data stream pulsing directly from the townhouse router to an external server hosted by my wife's shell company. Mara isolated the data packets and meticulously broke the encryption. We sat in the dead silence of the secure room and listened to the playback. The audio was crystal clear. It was the sound of my own voice, echoing off the marble countertops of my kitchen, aggressively discussing a confidential marketing budget from 3 weeks prior. Mara clicked another digital file. It was the sound of me pacing heavily in the master bedroom, muttering to myself about a frustrating legal clause in a pending vendor contract. A wave of profound, suffocating violation crashed over my entire body. She had not merely monitored my emails and forged my signature. She had planted the hidden, voice-activated recording software on the smart speakers scattered throughout our shared home. She had captured hundreds of hours of my private conversations, secure phone calls, and highly vulnerable moments behind closed doors. Mara looked at me, her face unusually pale. She calmly informed me that in our specific legal jurisdiction, recording private conversations without the explicit consent of all participating parties was not simply a grotesque breach of marital trust. It was a severe prosecutable felony. It instantly elevated the entire conspiracy from a complex corporate dispute regarding intellectual property into a massive, undeniable criminal offense carrying catastrophic civil and penal liabilities. The forged power of attorney was a sharp dagger. The illegal wiretapping was a nuclear warhead. I asked Mara to compile every single audio file, package them onto 3 encrypted flash drives, and prepare the certified transcripts for the board of directors. The blinding anger inside my chest had completely burned away, leaving absolutely nothing but a glacial, terrifying calm. The trap was now fully set. The steel doors were bolted shut, and there was precisely zero chance of survival for the architects of my ruin. Exactly 48 hours before the official board of directors was scheduled to convene, the architect of my professional demise decided to host a lavish, highly exclusive cocktail reception. The venue was a hyper-modern boutique hotel nestled in the most expensive quadrant of the downtown arts district, a space defined by its soaring ceilings, exposed industrial brick, and oppressive amounts of brushed brass. The stated purpose of the evening was to casually introduce a select group of high-net-worth prospective shareholders to Halcyon Table's brilliant new strategic creative partner. The digital invitation arrived in my personal inbox at exactly 6 o'clock the evening prior, a calculated afterthought. It was an astonishing display of arrogance. They did not invite me out of a lingering sense of professional courtesy. They invited me because they required an audience for their victory lap. It was a meticulously designed public humiliation. Graham and my spouse wanted me standing in that cavernous room, clutching a warm glass of sparkling water, forced to watch the intellectual property I had bled for seamlessly and legally transferred into the hands of my betrayer. They wanted the visible spectacle of my defeat to serve as the ultimate confirmation of their absolute power. I gave them exactly the visual they desperately craved. When I stepped out of the black town car and handed my keys to the valet, I was not wearing my usual tailored armor. I deliberately chose a shapeless, muted gray knit dress that hung off my frame, paired with sensible, flat leather shoes. I wore absolutely no makeup to hide the dark, bruised circles sitting heavily beneath my eyes. I pulled my hair back into a severe, messy knot. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the hotel ballroom entirely alone, projecting the fragile, hollowed-out posture of a woman who had finally been crushed beneath the grinding wheels of the corporate machine. The ambient lighting in the room was a warm, expensive gold, illuminating a sea of tailored suits and designer silk. Waiters glided silently across the polished concrete floors, balancing silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and intricate hors d'oeuvres. I stood near a massive concrete pillar near the back of the room, blending perfectly into the shadows, a ghost haunting the celebration of her own murder. At exactly 8 o'clock, the low hum of conversation faded as Graham Vale stepped up to a sleek acrylic podium positioned at the front of the room. He tapped the microphone, flashing his signature, blindingly white predatory smile. His speech was a masterclass in passive-aggressive corporate butchery. He spoke smoothly about how Halcyon Table was finally shedding the stagnant, overly cautious methodologies of the past. He used the word fearful twice, a thinly veiled, direct stab at my supposedly deteriorating mental state. He declared with booming confidence that the company was stepping into a bold, unprecedented new era of storytelling, an era requiring an entirely external, wildly courageous creative intellect. The unspoken translation rippled through the affluent crowd with absolute clarity. The old guard was officially being kicked to the curb, and the dead weight was finally being cut loose. Then, with a grand, sweeping gesture of his hand, Graham invited his new visionary to the stage. My wife walked up the short flight of stairs, bathed in a brilliant spotlight. She looked undeniably magnificent. She was wearing a sharp, asymmetric ivory suit that projected both ruthless authority and effortless creative flair. She took the microphone, surveyed the crowded room with absolute ownership, and began to speak. Watching her perform was the most profound psychological torture I had ever endured. She did not merely present my stolen ideas, she aggressively hijacked my entire professional identity. She told the story of brand transformation using my exact, distinct cadence. She utilized the specific architectural metaphors I always favored. She deployed the exact rhythmic pauses I used to build tension during high-level pitches. She was wearing my professional skin, projecting my brainwaves through her own vocal cords, charming the wealthy investors with the very soul she had meticulously extracted from my late-night whispers over the past 7 years. I stood completely motionless against the cold concrete pillar. I did not flinch. I did not let a single tear form in the corners of my eyes. I did not react publicly in any way. I simply watched the spectacular performance, while my right hand rested deep inside the pocket of my gray dress, gripping a cheap, prepaid burner phone. While my wife soaked in the applause of the room, a silent, catastrophic war was being waged entirely out of sight. At exactly 8:15, the burner phone vibrated a single time against my thigh. It was a blank text message from Mara. The signal had been given. Miles away from the glowing hotel ballroom, Mara and Evelyn's elite team of corporate litigators simultaneously executed the digital guillotine. They formally filed massive, legally binding data preservation notices and emergency temporary restraining orders with the federal district court. In a matter of seconds, every single corporate server at Halcyon Table, every encrypted cloud drive tied to my wife's shadow agency, and every personal mobile device belonging to Graham Vale was legally frozen. The trap snapped shut with devastating legal force. If either of them attempted to delete a single email, wipe a hard drive, or destroy a single audio file from this second forward, they would instantly trigger federal obstruction charges. But the true masterpiece of the evening was the physical delivery. I had coordinated with Evelyn to ensure the poison was injected directly into the bloodstream of the party. Right as my wife finished her triumphant closing remarks and stepped off the podium to mingle with the circling investors, two inconspicuous couriers entered the back of the ballroom. They seamlessly bypassed the security detail and approached two highly specific, profoundly influential legacy shareholders standing near the private bar. These were men who controlled massive voting blocks, men who despised risk and abhorred corporate scandal. The couriers handed each man a sleek, unmarked black envelope and vanished back into the lobby. I watched from the shadows as the two board members opened the envelopes. Inside was a hyper-condensed, highly lethal summary of Mara's forensic dossier. It contained the undeniable visual flowchart, proving the intellectual property leak, tracing the exact digital path from my secure home network, directly through my wife's fraudulent creative studio, and straight into the venture capital fund intimately tied to the chief executive officer standing across the room. The shift in the room's atmospheric pressure was instantaneous and incredibly violent. It was as if someone had opened a massive airlock and sucked all the oxygen out of the ballroom. The two legacy shareholders stopped drinking. Their faces turned the color of wet ash. They exchanged a single, panicked look before aggressively pulling their private legal counsels into a quiet, shadowed corner of the room. Whispers began to spread outward from that corner like a drop of black ink expanding rapidly in a glass of clear water. Within 10 minutes, the entire social dynamic of the room fractured. Prospective investors who had been clamoring to shake Graham's hand suddenly found themselves deeply fascinated by the architecture of the ceiling. The protective circle around the chief executive officer widened considerably as people instinctively backed away from what they suddenly realized was a walking liability. Graham felt the sudden drop in temperature. His brilliant smile faltered, his eyes darting nervously around the room, entirely unable to comprehend why his moment of absolute triumph was rapidly disintegrating into a localized quarantine zone. My wife noticed it too. Her sharp instincts kicked in immediately. She abandoned her conversation with a banking executive and scanned the perimeter of the room until her eyes locked directly onto mine. She expected to see me weeping. She expected to see me fleeing the room in an agonizing display of public humiliation. Instead, she found me standing perfectly still against the concrete pillar, my posture entirely relaxed, my hands resting casually by my sides. I held her gaze across the sea of tailored suits. I did not offer a vindictive smile or a dramatic glare. I gave her absolutely nothing but the dead, cold, terrifying stillness of a predator that has already secured its kill. In that fleeting fraction of a second, I saw the exact moment the devastating realization hit her. The blood drained completely from her flawless face. The arrogant confidence shattered, replaced by a sudden sickening flash of pure terror. She realized I was not broken. She realized I had not surrendered. She realized she had walked completely blind into an ambush of my own design. She took a hesitant step toward me, her mouth opening slightly, but I did not wait for her to cross the floor. I turned on my heel and walked quietly out the heavy glass doors into the cool night air. I had no intention of causing a messy, chaotic scene at a cocktail party. A public shouting match was beneath me, and it offered too many variables. I wanted the final, absolute kill shot to be delivered in the only arena where neither her masterclass acting skills nor Graham's corporate charisma could possibly save them. I wanted the execution to happen tomorrow morning in the official, soundproofed boardroom, on the permanent legal record, flanked by ruthless attorneys, where every single drop of their stolen power would be systematically drained in front of the entire governing body. The scheduled board of directors meeting convened on a Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. The official agenda circulated by Graham was aggressively straightforward. The primary objective was a formal vote to transition me into a nominal, powerless advisory role, while simultaneously ratifying a highly lucrative 5-year vendor contract with the newly celebrated external creative studio. I arrived at the corporate headquarters 45 minutes early. I did not walk in alone. Flanking me were my private litigator, Mara, and Evelyn, whose presence as the former chairwoman practically parted the seas of executive assistants in the lobby. We secured the primary boardroom before anyone else arrived, taking our seats on the far side of the massive, polished mahogany table. When Graham and my wife finally entered the room at 5 minutes to 9, laughing softly over a shared private joke, they froze. My wife's eyes instantly locked onto my face. The sickening realization from the hotel ballroom the night prior had clearly gnawed at her, but seeing me seated there, flanked by a digital forensics expert and a titan of the company's legacy, confirmed her deepest terrors. I was entirely calm. My hands were resting flat on the cool wood. I did not look like a grieving spouse or a defeated corporate casualty. I looked like a vault door clicking shut. That specific brand of unnatural silence made her physically shift in her chair, the velvet upholstery rustling as she suddenly recognized the difference between a victim and a hunter. Graham, however, was blinded by his own momentum. He called the meeting to order, cleared his throat, and confidently proposed the immediate restructuring of the strategy department. He asked for a motion to vote on the external vendor contract before a single board member could raise a hand. Evelyn leaned forward and pressed the microphone button at her seat. Her voice was like crushed glass. She formally demanded an immediate halt to the proceedings, invoking her legacy bylaws to present a matter of severe, catastrophic fiduciary betrayal. Graham attempted to interrupt, his face flushing with sudden anger, but Evelyn raised a single hand and silenced him. On cue, Mara plugged a heavily encrypted hard drive into the master console. The massive digital screens surrounding the boardroom flickered to life. We did not give them a moment to breathe. The presentation was a relentless, overwhelming barrage of undisputed facts. Mara displayed the exact chronological access logs of my secure cloud drives. Beside them, she projected the registered shell company documents naming my spouse alongside the hidden venture capital fund. The screen shifted to show the routing numbers of the massive wire transfers, the exact internet protocol addresses matching my home network, and finally, a side-by-side comparison of the stolen Sustainable Futures Initiative next to the competitor's finalized press release. Graham slammed both of his hands flat against the table, the sharp sound echoing off the glass walls. He shouted that the presentation was an outrageous, illegal fabrication constructed by a deeply unstable, disgruntled employee desperate to hold on to a failing career. He threatened to call corporate security and have us physically escorted from the building. Mara stepped away from the console and walked slowly down the length of the table. Her voice was completely devoid of emotion, a clinical autopsy of a crime scene. She meticulously explained the unalterable hash values of the digital evidence, the time-stamped server pings, and the precise, irrefutable data pathways. She explained the forensic trail so clearly and with such devastating technical authority that the entire room of billionaire investors and seasoned corporate attorneys fell into a profound, suffocating silence. Nobody looked at Graham. They all stared at the undeniable glowing proof of a hostile, internal corporate sabotage. The financial executives were calculating their losses, but my focus was entirely different. I did not address the stolen equity. I did not address my dismantled department. I turned my head slowly and looked directly across the vast expanse of mahogany at the woman wearing my wedding ring. "I have exactly one question," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yet it carried clearly to every corner of the dead silent room. How much of our marriage was actually real? The board members shifted uncomfortably, suddenly forced to witness a brutally intimate autopsy right in the middle of a corporate tribunal. My wife stared back at me. The carefully constructed mask of the caring, supportive partner finally cracked and shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. The warmth evaporated from her features, leaving behind a terrifying, sociopathic pragmatism. She was cornered, stripped of all her leverage, and she knew it. She remained silent for 10 agonizing seconds. When she finally opened her mouth, the sheer coldness of her response sent a visible shockwave through the room. "At the very beginning, it was strictly a strategic opportunity," she said, her voice completely flat. "But as time went on, things became complicated. It was the most violent, agonizing blow she could have possibly delivered. A complete denial would have been a standard lie. But that half-truth, the admission that I was initially targeted as nothing more than a profitable mark, and that her subsequent affection was merely an inconvenient complication to a business arrangement, was infinitely more cruel. I absorbed the hit without blinking. I simply nodded once. It was the final confirmation I needed to obliterate her completely. I signaled to Mara. The screen changed one last time, revealing an entirely new set of documents that even Evelyn had not seen until that morning. It was a digital trail Mara had extracted from the hidden server the previous night. It contained drafted divorce petitions, highly aggressive asset liquidation schedules, and private communications with a high-end real estate broker. I looked at my wife and laid her ultimate endgame bare for the room to see. She had not merely planned to assist Graham in pushing me out of the company, she had meticulously prepared a secondary assault. The moment I was stripped of my executive salary and emotionally devastated by the corporate exile, she intended to file for divorce, force a distress sale of the newly purchased townhouse, and legally claim half of my liquidated assets while I was in my most vulnerable, defenseless state. Before anyone could fully process the sheer malice of that secondary plot, I reached into my leather briefcase and dropped 2 heavy, physical manila folders directly onto the center of the table. I announced to the corporate counsel that the first folder contained irrefutable forensic proof of a forged electronic signature on a sweeping financial power of attorney document. I stated that the second folder contained certified transcripts and audio files of illegal voice-activated wiretapping software planted inside my private residence. The color completely drained from the lead corporate attorney's face. The dispute had instantly escalated from a messy intellectual property leak into a massive, multi-tiered criminal conspiracy involving wire fraud, identity theft, and felony eavesdropping. He stood up immediately, his voice trembling slightly. He declared for the official record that all pending contracts with the external studio were permanently voided. He ordered Graham Vale's immediate suspension, pending a full internal audit, and explicitly stated that the board would be handing the entire dossier directly over to federal and commercial criminal investigators before the end of the business day. My wife sat completely paralyzed in her ergonomic leather chair. Her eyes darted from the folders on the table back to my face. The terrible, crushing realization finally washed over her features. For weeks, she had been comfortably assuming I was a pathetic, emotionally broken woman blindly clinging to a failing relationship. She finally understood that I had known the absolute truth for a very long time. I had not confronted her in the kitchen because I was not interested in a domestic argument. I had patiently, ruthlessly waited for the exact, perfect moment to trap her inside a room with no exits, systematically destroying every single financial, legal, and professional benefit she had painstakingly built since the night she answered my joke proposal all those years ago. The immediate aftermath of that boardroom execution was a masterclass in corporate panic. Capital is fundamentally a coward when dragged into the blinding light of a public scandal, and the reaction was instantaneous. Within 24 hours, the hostile venture fund completely severed all ties with my spouse's shadow agency. scrubbing their digital footprint and publicly denying any knowledge of the corporate espionage. Graham was unceremoniously escorted out of the glass building by private security that very afternoon, his suspension pending a massive, ruthlessly thorough federal investigation. Every single contract tied to the external creative studio was legally voided, incinerated before the ink could even fully dry. 3 days later, the remaining members of the executive board, humbled and terrified of the looming public relations nightmare, formally invited me back. They did not just offer me my old position, they practically begged me to take the seat of interim chief strategy officer. They realized, with absolute crystal clarity, that I was the only person left in the building who intimately understood the soul of the company and possessed the cold, unshakable sanity required to pilot the ship out of the storm. A younger, more emotional version of myself might have accepted the offer immediately, tears of vindication in my eyes, grateful simply to have my home back. But the woman who survived that marriage no longer operated on sentimentality. I sat across from Evelyn and the remaining board members and refused to return out of a sense of corporate loyalty. I negotiated from a position of absolute, terrifying power. I demanded total, unmitigated creative control. I required ironclad legal clauses protecting my intellectual property moving forward, and most importantly, I demanded the immediate, systematic termination of every single executive who had been brought in under Graham's toxic network. They agreed to every single condition without a moment of hesitation. On the personal front, the devastation I unleashed was equally absolute. I did not file for a standard divorce. I filed for a complete legal annulment based on fraudulent inducement. I simultaneously unleashed a barrage of civil lawsuits against her, citing the forged digital access, the felony data breaches, and the severe financial damages related to our manipulated joint assets. I made sure her shadow company was buried under a mountain of litigation so heavy she would spend the next decade drowning in legal fees. The fallout within our mutual social circle was swift and brutal. Friendships fractured, and allegiances were violently redrawn. But as the undeniable forensic truth of her manipulation became public knowledge within our group, the narrative rapidly shifted. Many of our closest friends quietly admitted to me that looking back, they had always felt a subtle, unsettling unease around her. They confessed they had noticed how she was always just a little too skilled at orchestrating circumstances, a little too perfect at making her engineered manipulations look exactly like pure, serendipitous destiny. Hearing those confessions hurt, a dull ache in my chest for the 7 years of fabricated reality. But I was no longer blinded by the beautiful, toxic memories we had shared. The illusion was dead, and the clarity it left behind was incredibly sharp. The very last time I saw her was in the sterile, aggressively air-conditioned conference room of a downtown mediation firm. We were there to sign the final, binding legal agreements dissolving the last of our shared liabilities. She looked entirely different from the radiant, arrogant woman who had stood on that hotel stage. She looked hollowed out, exhausted, and remarkably small. She signed her name on the thick stack of papers without reading them, sliding the heavy folder back across the polished glass table. As I stood up to leave, gathering my coat, she finally spoke. Her voice was remarkably quiet, stripped of all its usual performative charm. She looked up at me, her eyes searching my face for a single drop of mercy, and asked me if I had ever actually loved her at any point during those 7 years. I stopped at the heavy oak door. I did not turn around completely, simply looking at her over my shoulder. I told her that yes, I had loved her deeply. I told her that my love was exactly what made her calculated betrayal so incredibly valuable to her in the first place. Because if there had been no genuine, unconditional love from my side, she never would have been able to extract so much power, so much access, and so much of my life. She needed my love to build her empire, and because she built it on a foundation of absolute fraud, it was exactly why she was now walking away with absolutely nothing. I opened the door and walked out, leaving her sitting alone in the cold room. The following month, I aggressively sold the townhouse. I wanted absolutely nothing to do with the heavy marble countertops or the velvet sofa where my demise had been plotted. I purchased a new apartment on the top floor of a converted industrial building downtown. It was significantly smaller, flooded with brilliant natural sunlight from massive floor-to-ceiling windows, and completely devoid of shadows. For the very first time in my entire adult life, I selected a living space, arranged the furniture, and curated the environment without factoring in a single inch of room for a second person. It was a space designed entirely for my own breathing. 6 months later, I stood before the expanded board of directors in my new, permanent capacity as the Chief Strategy Officer. I signed the finalized, legally protected initiative that would launch Halcyon Table's global recovery. The aggressive, highly successful model that Graham and my former spouse had so desperately tried to steal had now become the undeniable foundation lifting me higher than I had ever been in my career. They had tried to bury me with my own blueprint, and instead, they had simply handed me the exact schematics I needed to build my own throne. Sitting in my new apartment late that night, looking out over the glowing skyline of the city, my mind drifted back to that damp, freezing night on the rooftop 7 years ago. For the longest time, I truly believed my entire life had changed because of a single, sarcastic joke shared between best friends. But the absolute truth was something far more profound. My life changed because I survived the one person who knew my psychology better than anyone else in the world, and I still consciously chose to stand back up and destroy her. That casual, wine-soaked joke of a proposal did not lead me to an eternity of unconditional love. Instead, it led me directly to the coldest, cleanest, and most deeply deserved revenge of my entire life. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please drop a comment below and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by even more people.